In this Q&A video, we cover the Canadian truckers, Russia and Ukraine energy policy, and a whole lot more. So let's dive straight in. Left-wing parties keep using language like, I stand with 90% of truckers who are vaccinated. Are they confusing the patience people have had up until now with support? Most people I talk to who are vaccinated are tired of the mandates and rules. Am I wrong and the media and politicians see something I don't? Am I just part of a fringe minority? That sort of thing is traditional campaign language. They are trying to get the right response from you and to prevent you from being seduced into supporting the protests and adding to their problem. So especially if people are frustrated and therefore might be quite likely to sympathise with or see common cause with the protesters, campaigners and politicians would want to underline, therefore, why they are, in fact, totally different from those people. So it goes something like this. Of course you're frustrated. We understand. But yours is a noble frustration because you did the right thing. You got vaccinated. The vast majority of truckers did as well. You are the good people. And if they can advocate that the reason why you're frustrated is because of people like them, then all the better. Those unvaccinated weirdos or white supremacists or whatever label they're putting on them today, it's because of them that we haven't been able to open up yet, because of course we really want to. We know how frustrated you are. I point out, as I always do, that I support the vaccinations. I do not support the division that is being created by governments between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated as a process of them putting as much pressure as possible onto those people to do as they're told. I contrast that approach with the dignity we saw this week from Novak Djokovic with his recent statement where he said, he follows the rules. He won't play the tennis tournaments if the rules say that he can't play them. He's not an anti-vaxxer, he's not campaigning for anything, he just insists on the right to his personal decision over what he puts into his body. If your politicians can't respect that because they fear it will somehow undermine their campaign message, I would argue they've lost sight of the nature of their role. Now that said, there are plenty of people who are fed up with restrictions who also don't agree with the approach of the protesters. Not everything has to be black and white. All right, a related question, slightly shortened. From Justin Trudeau being ridiculed through American parents standing up to queer theory in education to Caius College trying to return heterodoxy to their college, there seems to be a shift in the so-called culture war. Is this just wishful thinking on my part because I tend to see these stories owing to my viewing preferences, or is there a measurable change in the attitude of those outside the usual ideological tribes? First of all, congratulations in considering the possibility that you may be influenced by wishful thinking and the awareness that you're getting a filtered view of the world based on your preferences. That is a great indicator of the self-awareness skills that support critical thinking. As to the substance of your question, I think it's more an indicator that the nature of the current discourse isn't exactly what you may think it is. On the right, they feel the biggest thing happening is the uniform lunacy of the left. On the left, they feel the biggest thing happening is the uniform lunacy of the right. Now look, whether they're currently equivalent isn't the point. Both sides amplify the most extreme examples of behaviour on the other side and believe that it represents all of those on that side. We all generalise the other side. What we're really seeing is a rise in populism on both the left and the right that takes distinctive forms. And the people on the left and right, there are plenty of them, resisting that populism. There are people on the left pushing back against woke nonsense, trying to hold on to traditional values of rules-based society, given voice by people like Bill Maher in the semi-mainstream. There are those in the Republican Party like Mitch McConnell who are lining up for a fight against the populist version of their party that will claim stolen elections for any future elections they lose, and the eccentric types they attract like Marjorie Taylor Greene and so on. Both sides are going to be fighting for the centre ground in US politics. And right now the momentum is with the right, because the crazy wokeness has spread so much further into the institutions and in a way that is now starting to inflict harm on ordinary people. The left have always believed that if you can educate the kids right, some would use the word indoctrinate, but if you can educate the kids right, then those ideas become the standards for society. But when the ideas have reached the point of encouraging children to question their own gender and conspiring with them against their parents if they do so, and forcing toddlers to wear masks, which, by the way, no other country in the world is doing, and teaching white children that they are oppressors, not innocent of racial guilt, where those things are being done, then yes, parents are going to revolt. Not just right-wing, terrible parents, the vast majority of normal, non-ideological parents as well. So we're seeing some pushback because of overreach. And we're seeing some growing awareness as a result on the left that there has been overreach. And there'll be some adjustment as a result, some counterattack. That's all the political toing and froing. I do think that will result in a minor retreat in terms of mainstream opinion. The thing is, the true woke ideologues, like all ideologues, they have zero self-awareness and almost as much political nous and strategy. So I don't think they'll be able to help themselves but to offer up more hostages to fortune. In other words, the battle is more even than you think. There is a negative bias in our news streams. But no, it's not just going to go away because the battle is joined. Not yet. It's going to take something a bit bigger, which may well come in 2024. With all of the news regarding the conditions of both China and the US economies, both predicted to fail at a catastrophic level, the question is which one goes first, and obviously after the first one fails, will the other be pulled in also? Predictions are a dime a dozen, of course. Just because somebody says it doesn't mean it's definitely about to happen. The challenge for predictions is that we have a bunch of pretty unprecedented changes going on. I mean, we're entering a new era of world power conflict in which nobody dares to turn it into a direct shooting war because the powers have the capacity to destroy each other a number of times over. We also then have a period of stabilising populations and probably shrinking populations in the developed wealthy countries. We have a global transition to net zero, which, whether you think that to be a good idea or not, is certainly right now being extremely badly and chaotically managed. And then you can add in the traditional forces, some of which I discussed in Monday's video talking about Ray Dalio's recent book. On those traditional grounds alone, you would expect a continued gradual decline of the US economy compared to other leading countries until the point, still some way off, when it finally loses its reserve currency status, at which point its debt burden will become much heavier. There will be mini shocks along the way, bubbles and mini debt crises, inflationary cycles, the death of 1,000 cuts and so on, unless the US internal conflicts tip over into actual civil war or something close to it. Dalio thinks that less likely because, as he sees it, the US Constitution is so strong and accordingly so well respected across the world. I think that could easily be wishful thinking. The US Constitution makes governing the country more or less impossible in the modern era. It's incredibly hard to change it to become more suited to current conditions. The inability to evolve your governance with the times could easily make it more likely that there'll be a major conflict because you can't get change any other way. We shall see. China's economy seems unlikely to go catastrophically wrong unless they do something stupid and end up in a shooting war, or their strong grip on their population begins to falter, which would be good, but it's not yet in sight. It has a debt problem, but nowhere near as much as the US, and much of that debt is tied into investment, which should return dividends in due course. But it is likely to be the first great power candidate in history to end up with a static or declining population. The demographic impact of that is going to change things up a lot. We just don't quite know how. And of course, as an authoritarian government, it always has the capacity to be laid low by a period of bad leadership, since the checks and balances don't exist in that sort of government. It now seems abundantly clear that in moving away from domestic gas production, UK energy policymakers committed a serious strategic misstep. In political terms, do you believe there is sufficient will yet to reconsider the subject? Where are we on the dial, and which way is the needle moving? Also, in practical terms, what are the obstacles, technical and engineering, to getting the wells producing again? And if greenlit, how long would that take? So I don't think it was moving away from domestic gas production that was the mistake per se. It was the failure of successive governments to properly invest in the energy resources needed for a stable, well-balanced, reliable energy supply. There were various choices about how you could do that, but you had to get on and do one of them or more. Whether that's more about failing to exploit fracking, reducing gas storage capacity in the country, failing to invest in building replacement nuclear capacity when it needed to be done. Any or all of those things could have had a part. Any or all of those things could have been left out if you had an alternative that fulfilled the same role. Need a core of reliable, always-on power? Well, okay, if not fossil fuels, that's presumably nuclear. If not fossil fuels or nuclear, well, fine, but what? I mean, personally, I don't care what the answer is. I have no personal favourite energy source, but you need to have an answer. Over decades, governments have avoided unpopular decisions, kicked the can down the road, and that helped to make us more vulnerable to world disruption. Now, okay, we are where we are. But in the same way, the answer to having gotten here isn't necessarily to rush off and restart local gas production. But it has to be something that is designed to produce relatively short-term stability and bring prices down while laying better considered and careful foundations for the net zero project. Because let's be clear, it's not beyond human ability to move towards a post-fossil fuel world without chaos and high costs in the transition. But if you're going to insist on incompetent government, and why would you? But here we are. Maybe then it would be best to prioritise stability of supply as top priority first. Because, if someone can't yet walk in a straight line, maybe not ask them to dance a tango just yet. I'd rather have competent government and we cracked on with the task at hand. Don't get me wrong. We're at a moment in history where that seems a little way off. And if we do it and get it catastrophically wrong, then the backlash, the deserved backlash and the suffering from the energy crisis will outweigh any of the benefits you would have achieved. As for our available assets, let's not assume that there's an easy short-term way out. The fracking sites have been ordered to be sealed by the UK regulator, a move that the company Quadrilla described as ridiculous, although, to be fair, you could say they would say that, wouldn't they? North Sea Oil and Gas has received approval for further development. That will take time to come through, and it's diminishing returns from the North Sea anyway. Luckily, this winter so far hasn't been especially cold, so that has helped the country to scrape through without the worst consequences. Keeping your fingers crossed for unseasonably good weather, even if ironically global warming makes that more likely, should not be confused with an energy policy. All right, a related question. Mallen, what effect will the huge rise in energy prices have on the wind and solar industry? Wind was cheap before. Surely the hike in gas and oil makes wind and solar even cheaper. The rise in gas and oil prices certainly won't hurt renewables, but they don't provide an uncomplicated boost because you're always comparing a reliable, always available energy source with an intermittent one. If they had similar functions in a balanced energy grid, and wind and solar was just cheaper, then there'd be no stopping them. But they have to be balanced with energy storage capacity, conversion capacity, and the alternative always-on sources, such as nuclear, involve long lead times and high upfront investment. So the short-term pain is going to be more about motivating political leaders to take long-delayed difficult decisions than it is simply about the price mechanism working in the marketplace, although, of course, there will be some of that effect. Some political commentators are referring to the Russia-Ukraine situation as akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in full swing as I was being born. Also talking about appeasement of Russia, such as admitting that Ukraine will not be joining NATO as our Munich moment. What are your feelings on this, Mallen? Could it just be posturing, theatre and distraction, or something much worse? Well, I don't know about Munich moment. I generally think comparisons with Hitler and Nazi Germany to be a bad idea because it distracts attention from the point being made as much as anything else. I describe it like this. China and Russia are both fully aware that the United States and the West in general is in decline. both of their different reasons for pushing and challenging to establish the point where America will back down because it no longer has the resolve to fight. There are two strands of thought on Putin. The first is that piling into an all-out war isn't his style, as I relayed in my video on the topic a few weeks ago, but that he will feed off the uncertainty of others to sow discord and confusion in order to further his strategic objectives. So that patient Putin, as we might call him, might well follow that strategy of pushing until the point when it becomes obvious to the leaders of Ukraine that the West has lost the will to stand up for them in any meaningful way, and at that point Ukraine will be able to be pressured into a closer relationship that over time becomes full union. Putin's absolute conviction, which is written about at length, is that Russia and Ukraine are one people. Now that would work, and that goes with the grain of who he is. The counter-argument to that is that Putin might now be an old man in a hurry, not patient Putin. He is 70 years old after all, and he wants to be the one who rights the historical mistake in his eyes of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he probably doesn't think his successors will be as skilled at manipulating the West as he is. So, against his better judgment, he might feel impelled to go for the big push while he still can. The question will be whether the divided response of the West in the last few weeks was sufficiently feeble to take the biggest risk of his presidency. My gut instinct is that he won't. I know that's my gut instinct because for the last couple of weeks I've been hearing Biden and others talking up the imminence of invasion any day now. And every time I heard it, I thought it was odd and I just didn't believe it. The truth is you could toss a coin on this. I think Putin's decision is extremely finely balanced. He could go either way. I expect we will know within days of this video going live. But if he steps back for now, it will be a tactical retreat to await the next opportunity to ratchet that pressure back up a little bit more. Can the rise of Safetyism be attributed to the increasing role of women in positions of power and influence? As women achieve greater prominence in politics, on editorial boards and as leaders of institutions such as the CDC, does their natural inclination to risk aversion, nurturing and empathy, which has served the human species well at the family level, lead to excess caution and compassion, timidity, indecisiveness and stunted innovation at the social level? Maybe. I'd be interested to see some research that looks into it properly. I've seen no evidence for it. Given the natural tendency of wealthy, peaceful societies to become softer and more decadent through the ages, I think it's more easily attributable to broad human nature. You know, people who have fought in the trenches don't worry about microaggressions or the danger of sharp edges on furniture. There is a danger that if you get organisations that hire purely on diversity, not on character or ability, then some would surely make that mistake. But mostly you can point at strong and effective female leaders and weak and decisive ones just as you can for male leaders. There's no doubt that if you're talking about broad numbers and psychology, fewer women decide that they are prepared to subject themselves to the ridiculous, uncompromising total commitment that it often takes to become a corporate CEO or a political leader for that matter. Those that do, however, generally do so because they have the fire, they have the hunger to do the job, and all the top corporate women bosses I came across when I was at Business in the Community, people like Diane Thompson, the chief executive of Camelot, they were highly effective. I wouldn't generalise unless I had data to go on. Since YouTube seems to be deleting my comments about things we did wrong, I'll make this short. Is there anything we got right about the pandemic? It is a growing frustration to me how YouTube comments keep reportedly disappearing from the channel. I went to look at the last video a couple of days ago and it said it had 71 comments and I counted and there were 41. That's nearly half. So please keep trying. I want to read your comments, even if YouTube thinks them too dangerous to be allowed out into the world. As to your question, what did we get right about the pandemic? Well, look, we developed vaccines quickly and to scale, which was and remains an extraordinary feat of innovation and mobilisation. Yes, politicians managed then to destroy trust in the process by insisting that nobody would be respected if they chose not to have one. That shouldn't take away from the scale of that achievement. It's pretty hard to find many other aspects where I would argue we got things right. If we manage over the coming couple of years to reflect in more sensible frame of mind and learn the lessons from what we got wrong, that I would then count as a second great achievement. I'm not hugely optimistic on that score right now. Considering the direction the West is going with net zero carbon, why would the West walk out of Afghanistan, leaving behind a possible $3 trillion worth of lithium, which would be needed for essential battery storage? Are we going towards hydrogen fuel cells instead, or is there a cheaper, better battery technology coming into production soon, or are we just going to buy everything from China? I don't think we're going to go to hydrogen fuel cells. I don't see any momentum for that. And let's be clear, the West walked out of Afghanistan because the cost of staying there became too high. It's all very well saying that there's large amounts of lithium reserves there. I'd seen $1 trillion worth quoted, but whatever, it's a lot. But you have to be able to get at it, otherwise it's effectively zero. And historically, the conflict between warring tribes and with the Taliban made that impractical. And bear in mind, the West no longer accesses minerals by invading countries and helping themselves to whatever they find. I mean, that was part of a business model in the past, but progress, it's not anymore. If someone can access those minerals, then the West would be competing for the right to trade with them, a process that could help to pull Afghanistan out of its desperate poverty. It is not currently, of course, in the Taliban playbook. You may not have noticed, they're not tremendously entrepreneurial like that. Now, obviously, China has been supporting the Taliban with the hope of initially, at least, preventing them from allowing Uyghur rebels from using their country as a base for attacks against Chinese targets. But in addition, if the Taliban, with that Chinese support, could eventually unify and dominate Afghanistan in a way they haven't been able to in the past, then perhaps that could begin to open up exactly that sort of trade to China's exclusive benefit. That's what they're hoping for. Would the West have been prepared to support the Taliban in the same way in order to achieve that sort of access to minerals? Obviously not. I kind of think that's to our credit. We're competing hard elsewhere to get direct access to minerals, as I discussed in my video about rare earth minerals. But we are not in pole position in that contest, that is for sure. Is Joe Rogan a racist? Seriously, some comments on the Rogan Spotify debacle would be appreciated. I don't know. I doubt it. I've seen nothing in Joe Rogan's public persona to indicate that he is a racist. And it is, after all, a standard playbook when a certain group of people want to bring someone down to seek to do it with exactly those sorts of accusations and with things taken out of context and so on. So he used the N-word a few times in the past. Do you know what? I do not care. Are we supposed to pretend that it wasn't previously unsayable? That in the past it was just a word, that the use of which was judged by the context of how it was used? I mean, fine, make it into a modern taboo to say it at all if you must. Do it in a weird way that means some people are allowed to say it and other people aren't. Okay, so long as everyone knows the rules, it doesn't matter if they're a bit random. Lots of taboos don't necessarily make rational sense. Fine, but don't apply them retrospectively, pretending that it's always been that way. I think it's the same with things like white people wearing blackface. Personally, I don't see the problem. People pretending to be something other than what they are. Human beings have had endless fun doing that for the whole of human history. But fine, you're going to get all hypersensitive about it and decide that it's really saying something awful things that none of us would want to say. Fine, we shouldn't do that. And, it could be worse. At least we don't get women to bind their feet. So if we're going to have irrational phobias and customs, we're on the bearable end of the spectrum. But do I care that you can find old photographs of people blacked up? No, not unless there's clear evidence that it was done in some way that was intended to be a racist statement. Even Justin Trudeau. I mean, sure, it's fun that an architect of hyper-wokeness should get hoist on his own petard. But apart from the irony, no, I don't care that he blacked up in the past when it was an unremarkable thing to do. It's just unfortunate that he doesn't have the courage to say so, to say, look, things were different then and we shouldn't pretend otherwise, rather than all the cringing apologies and all the performance aspect. And by the way, before anyone asks, full disclosure, no, I'm not aware that I've ever had cause to say the N-word in the past. Neither have I ever blacked up for anything. So I'm not getting my defence in early or anything like that. But if I had done either of those things in the context of what was entirely normal and uncontroversial at the time, I sure wouldn't be apologising for it now, and neither should anybody else. Imposing retrospective morality is the action of the idiot mob, and the best way is not to bow to it. To kind of come back to the question, I respect Joe Rogan because he has been prepared to talk to a wide range of people and to have straightforward, honest conversations with them. Has he made mistakes? Yes, of course, we all make mistakes. And what he said in his recent mea culpa, that he should do a bit more research on the people and the issues that he's getting into and their positions on everything, that is absolutely his responsibility as an influential figure. If I had his audience, I would absolutely stand up to see that as my responsibility to them. But the point of doing that shouldn't be then to simply avoid all the people who piss off the establishment. Just have a conversation that manages to keep its feet on the ground a bit more. Luckily, Joe Rogan seems too big to cancel. Largely because, although he may have made mistakes, he clearly has good intent, for all that some will suggest otherwise. He and Jordan Peterson, so far, have been the ones that the mob has gone after and have found that although they could wound them, they couldn't yet topple them. And I agree with both of them on many things, and I disagree with them profoundly on some things. But thank goodness that they are there, that they are able to piss off the establishment and keep going regardless. All right, a related question. Legacy media versus random access media, or ruling class losing control of the narrative. I've not heard the phrase random access media before, but I get the general idea. I think the ruling class having control of a narrative proposal is a bit overblown. I don't recall a time when there was just one narrative and that people were expected to be able to control it. It's just not how it works. We've seen it emerging to some extent in relation to the big two issues where science and public policy are in big overlap, so the pandemic and then climate change. That has seen the emergence of a style of official communication that indulges in campaign messaging to a much larger, more overt degree with less tolerance for alternatives. But there has always been that alternative narrative, even if you had to go to the fringes to find it. Government has never been able to control such things. The challenge we have is that both narratives, if you like, have pushed to extremes that are no longer grounded in reality. Unfortunately, independent media isn't yet proving superior in terms of its commitment to finding the truth wherever it lies. It's too dependent on algorithms that reward pushing to the extremes, and people follow incentives, whether they're in the establishment or not. Until we get a truly popular alternative to the polarisation, a commitment to, facts with attitude, an alt-centre, if you will. And I don't think that we will have more than competing extremes fighting to establish their different narratives with a large enough tribe of the converted to meet their business or political goals. There is a lot more to be said on that topic than we have time for here. Okay, I had one other question about Steve Donziger, which I'm fairly sure I've spoken about before. Although I know it's not helpful to say that if I can't point you to where I spoke about it before. I would have to go into the detail of what that case is about. We don't really have the capacity to do that here, so apologies to that questioner. That's it for now. See you at the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.